History is often defined as the clash between civilizations and their struggle for dominance. Throughout the Middle Ages, while most of Europe lay dormant, humanity saw the rise of a prosperous Middle Eastern Islamic civilization, which carried the torch after the decline of the Greek and Roman world. Yet by the 13th century, the Islamic world was in decline, and the onslaught of the Mongol hordes threatened to undo much of what remained. The Mongols devastated China and swept westward, subduing much of Central Asia and piercing deep into Persia. In 1257, Hulagu and the Ilkhans took Baghdad and thereby extinguished one of the last great lights of the Islamic world. Yet although hope looked scarce, a new force, the Mamelukes, rose up and resisted. Originally a class of Islamic slave soldiers, they seized power in Egypt and created a lasting dynasty. In 1260, they clashed with the Mongols at Ain Jalut, a decisive victory that turned the tide against the invaders and marked the decline of the Mongol rule over the Western world. But who were the Mamelukes, and how were they able to stop one of the greatest forces in history? In this paper, I will discuss the origins of the Mamelukes and their rise to power. I will also discuss the Mongols and their differences. I will look at the Battle of Ain Jalut, as well as other Mamluk-Mongol engagements, and analyze what conditions led to the outcome. The term Mamluk refers to a slave soldier. Muslim rulers had adopted the practice of purchasing warriors from foreign lands since the 10th century, and this practice continued well into the Ayyubid and Ottoman era. Warriors were bought in large numbers from faraway lands, some from other Islamic kingdoms and many from barbarian peoples such as the Turks, the Kipchaks, and even the Mongols. The term, however, can be misleading. While they were purchased as a commodity and bound to their buyer like slaves, they were treated much differently. In Egypt, they were given better education and housing than most people, and in later Ottoman times, their equipment was notably superior. They were bound to a code of honor and conduct called the Firasiya, which could be compared to the European knighthood tradition. They were also allowed to hold official positions with great prestige, as we will see later. The advantages of the slave soldier system were clear. Since the soldiers had no family ties nor ethnic connections in the countries they served in, they were totally loyal to the will of the ruler who purchased them. This loyalty became crucial in an era where ethnic tensions and personal gain had recently caused a fragmentation of the once mighty Islamic empires. Among buyers and scholars, there was also a degree of respect for their humble origins, which were thought to increase purity and piety. Muslim scholar Ibn Khaldun wrote, "By means of slavery they learned glory and blessing and are exposed to divine providence. Cured by slavery, they enter the Muslim religion with the firm resolve of true believers and yet with nomadic virtues, unsullied by debased nature, unadulterated by the filth of pleasure, undefiled by the ways of civilized living, and with their ardor unbroken by the profusion of luxury." The tale of the Mamluks' rise to power begins in the Ayyubid dynasty of Egypt. Although Mamluk troops had been purchased since the beginning of the dynasty, it was the later Sultan Al-Salih Ayyub who became the first to employ an army made up almost entirely of them. His reliance on Mamluks may come from an event when his conventional army deserted him in Syria, leaving him only with his faithful Mamluks. Soon, the entirety of his army was made of Turkish and Kurdish Mamluks, which went against the traditional idea of having a varied army. When he died in 1249, a long and complex set of secession struggles took place, which may have paved the way for the Mamluk takeover. However, it was a decisive battle that truly allowed the Mamluks to formally take control. In 1249, a French army led by Louis IX landed in Egypt, which was then thought to be the most important Muslim stronghold in the Mediterranean. By spring of 1250, they arrived near Al-Mansura. The Mamluk troops were given control and lured the French into the city, only to surround it and inflict heavy losses, perhaps as high as 15,000. Louis was imprisoned for a while and later released only after being ransomed for the handsome sum of 400,000 dinars. He then fled to Acre with the few prisoners the Mamluks decided to release, thereby putting an end to the Seventh Crusade. With this victory, the Mamluks could claim to be not only the defenders of Egypt, but the defenders of Islam as well. Historians have also noted that because Al-Salih Ayyub died in the middle of the war with the French, the Mamluks may have exploited the power vacuum to take control. His successor, Turan Shah, was an Ayyubid and was soon assassinated, most likely by Mamluk agents, and the Mamluks officially took control of the state, first through Commander Aybak and shortly after with Qutuz. The Mamluks renamed the new dynasty the Bahri after one of their regiments and promised to continue the ruling patterns of Al-Salih Ayyub. The Mamluk army was organized into three parts. The first two, the Royal Mamluks and the Halqa Corps, were both subordinate to the Sultan. The third group, the Mamluk-ul-Umara, belonged to the emirs, representing a more localized control. Of the purchased warriors, most were cavalry from the steppes, and most retained their traditional weapons and armor, although they were supplied with chainmail in Egypt often. The typical armament for a cavalry fighter was a spear and a sword, although bows were not uncommon, and of course all these weapons would later be replaced by firearms. The Mamluk institution as a whole tried to keep its nomadic vitality by continually recruiting new troops, creating a one-generation military aristocracy. On the other side of Asia, a different force had been rising. The Mongols had come from a land that bred some of the fiercest warriors in history. The desolate geography and ecology of their homeland had bred both people and animals that were hardy and tough. Mongol horses were known to have much greater endurance than many other breeds, as well as being better suited for rough, desolate terrain. This might explain why the Mongol hordes were able to sweep quickly across the lands, as well as being able to conquer such otherwise uninhabitable places such as Russia and Afghanistan. The Mongol war tradition was also without match. There is evidence that the infamous Huns, known also as the Shognu, may also have originated from the steppes north of China before sweeping across Central Asia and challenging the might of Rome. However, throughout most of the history of this area, the people of the Mongolian steppes were divided and frequently engaged in tribal warfare. Both their natural hardiness of the people and their tradition of constant warfare had bred some of the most feared warriors in history. When Genghis Khan was able to unify them, he unleashed a force that rocked the world. Soon he had subdued most of China, and by his death in 1227 his dominion stretched across most of East and Central Asia. His successors, although fragmented into several khanates, continued his legacy of conquest. In 1257, the Ilkhans, led by Hulagu, took Baghdad after routing the defending army. During the sacking, between 100,000 and 1 million people were killed, and much of the city was destroyed, including the complex sewer and irrigation systems, which would not be rebuilt for centuries. The shock to the Muslim world was huge. The light of the East had been extinguished, and Abbasid power had at last been totally broken. Both the Muslim and Christian kingdoms began to wonder if the Mongols could be stopped. The path to conflict began with the interesting relations between the Mamluks and the Ilkhans. Despite the tendency of the Muslim rulers to portray the Mongols as the scourge of God, relations between the Mamluks and the Ilkhans were, initially, rather tame. This is for two reasons. First, there were a noteworthy number of Mongols in Egypt. Some were families who had sought asylum there, while others were warriors who had served in the Mamluk Corps. Second, the Mamluks had been somewhat influenced by the Mongols. There had been a definite borrowing of Mongol customs among the Mamluk elite. For example, Sultan Baybars had been a great admirer of the Mongols and had taken to using tent mosques, as well as eating horse meat and wearing certain types of Mongol clothing. There is even some speculation that the Mamluks' law codes had been influenced by the Yasa, or goat of Genghis Khan, although this is debated and somewhat unlikely. By the time the Ilkhans had conquered most of Iran and Mesopotamia, rivalries between them and the Golden Horde in Russia had grown. Ilkhan diplomacy seems to suggest that holding their territory in the Caucasus seemed more important than expanding into Syria and Palestine. Why, then, did they clash with the Mamluks from Egypt? Charles Hopperlin argues that the connection involved the presence of the Kipchak people. The Kipchaks had been another nomadic Turkic people who had originated in the Central Asian steppes near the Caucasus. They had good relations with Kievan Rus, and later became part of the forces of the Golden Horde, who ruled there, and were therefore rivals of the Ilkhans. More importantly, the Kipchaks had never had friendly relations with the Mongols, after the army under Genghis Khan turned against them and drove them out of Khwarezm. Halperin notes that the Mongol conquest had made it possible for Kipchaks to be hired into foreign armies. Indeed, even Kutuz was a Kipchak who had fled Khwarezm earlier. Much of the Mamluk army was in fact comprised of Kipchaks. Therefore, it is likely that the Kipchak connection, as he calls it, was a tension and rivalry between the two peoples which may have led to the conflicts between them, although one should also note that some Kipchaks served in the Mongol army earlier under Batu Khan. Halperin refers to the encounter as waving multiple red flags at an already raging bull. It is also worth mentioning that the emperor of the Golden Horde at that time had converted to Islam, although this is less important since the Mongols were generally tolerant of other religions, taking both Christian and Muslim allies into their forces at times. The path to conflict was therefore paved not with religious differences, but rather with tribal and ethnic rivalries. As mentioned earlier, the Mongols held Kutuz and the Kipchaks in contempt for fleeing from the Mongol onslaught on the east. In 1260, Hulagu, in typical Mongol fashion, sent this threatening letter to Kutuz in Cairo. From the King of Kings of the East and West, the Great Khan, to Kutuz the Mameluke, who fled out to escape our sword. You should think of what happened to other countries and submit to us. You have heard now how we have conquered a vast empire and have purified the earth of the disorders that tainted it. We have conquered vast areas, massacring the people. You cannot escape from the terror of our armies. Where can you flee? What road will you use to escape us? Our horses are swift, our arrows sharp, our swords like thunderbolts, our hearts as hard as the mountains, our soldiers as numerous as the sand. Fortresses will not detain us, nor arms stop us. Your prayers to God will not avail against us. We are not moved by tears, nor touched by lamentations. Only those who beg our protection will be safe. Hasten your reply before the fire of war is kindled. Resist and you will suffer the most terrible catastrophes. We will shatter your mosques and reveal the weaknesses of your God, and then will kill your children and your old men together. At present you are the only enemy against whom we have to march. When Kutuz killed the messengers that brought this message, Hulagu was enraged and marched his army southwards towards Egypt. Fortunately for the Mamelukes, the death of Mongke, Great Khan of China, forced him to return to the east and decide secession, taking much of his army with him. He left behind only 20,000 troops under the control of his general Kitbuka. This alone may have been the incident that saved Egypt. The French Crusader kingdoms, although neutral, favored the Mamelukes slightly and allowed them safe passage through Palestine. On September 3, 1260, the two armies met at Ain Jalut, a spring in the region of Galilee, known also as Goliath's Well. Both armies numbered around 20,000. Both armies were diverse, the Mamluk corps having Egyptian, Kipchak, and even Mongol warriors, and the Ilkhan forces having allies from Georgia and Armenia. The Mamluks use a trap to surround the Mongol forces and cause heavy casualties. The Mongols, however fierce, were unable to escape and were routed. Many factors contributed to the Mamluk victory. Perhaps most important were the tactics used by the Mamluks. Having first arrived and being more familiar with the terrain, Kutuz was able to lay a trap. Hiding most of his forces in the hills surrounding the highlands, he left a smaller detachment, led by Baibars, as bait. The Mongols took it and pursued Baibars, forcing him into the highland plain. Once Kitbuka's forces were in the open, Kutuz sprung the trap. The Mongols were completely surrounded and began taking heavy fire from Mamluk archers. Having realized his mistake, Kitbuka led a fierce charge against the left wing of Kutuz's army. Before they could break out, Kutuz led a heroic charge by removing his helmet and rallying his troops to the cry of Wa Islama, or O my Islam. Having both the geographical and psychological advantage, the Mamluks continued to fight hard until victory was at hand. Although some Ilkhan troops were able to escape, their total losses were heavy, and Kitbuka himself was killed while fighting to the death. The bait ambush strategy Kutuz employed may have been learned from earlier battles with the Mongols, who used it frequently as a variety of the divide-and-conquer strategy which Genghis Khan frequented. By using the geography to his advantage and by using his enemy's tactics against him, Kutuz therefore displayed superior generalship, which was a deciding factor. Events and conditions before the battle may have also played a part. Rivalry with the other Mongol kingdoms may have weakened the generalship of the Ilkhans. Most importantly, the terrain may have hindered the strength of the Mongol warriors and horses. Although the Mongols had originally planned to return their horses to the pasturelands of Hungary, they instead marched southwards into Syria, where there was much less room for grazing, and thus their forces could have been weakened. There is debate about this, however, since a large part of the Mongol force was actually infantry from Georgia and Armenia. A more likely cause is the heat of the Syrian region. Although the Mongols had succeeded in dominating harsh, colder regions such as Russia and the mountains of Central Asia, they were likely not used to the dry heat of the Middle East, unlike the Mamluks, who had had more time to adjust. Since the numbers were relatively even, some scholars point to technological supremacy as an important factor. Although the Mamluks were later famed for their heavy cavalry, it is likely that most of the forces at Ain Jalut were lighter horsemen purchased from the northern steppes. However, what is interesting is that the battle is the first to see the use of the midfa, or hand cannon. Although gunpowder-based weapons were primitive at the time and would probably not inflict much damage, it is likely that the weapons frightened enemy horsemen and had caused detrimental disorder. The aftermath of the battle left a legacy as important as the battle itself. Ain Jalut marked the first victories for Mamluk-ruled Egypt, as well as the beginning of the decline in Mongol power. The Mamluks would go on to expel the Mongols from Syria in 1260. Mongol morale was weakened, as well as unity. Berke Khan, ruler of the Golden Horde Khanate in Russia, had converted to Islam sometime before. After hearing of the destruction of Baghdad and the assault on Syria by Hulagu, he promised to bring retribution, stating, "He has sacked all the cities of the Muslim and has brought about the death of a caliph. With the help of God, I will call him to account for so much innocent blood. Berke lured the armies and attentions of the Ilkhans away to the north, thus preventing Hulagu from recapturing Syria and Egypt. This became the first civil war among the Mongols and marked the end of a unified Khanate. The Mamelukes would continue to rule in Egypt until the 1500s when the Ottomans took control. However, Mamluk sultans would still rule, however, until 1801 with the invasion of Napoleon's troops. Napoleon, however, went on to establish a Mamluk corps, which not only drew on the traditions and tactics of the Mamluks, but used Mamluk recruits from Syria as well. Although many of the Mamluks originated in the uncivilized hinterlands of Asia, on the fringe of the civilized world, they went on to become both the defenders of Islam and the defenders of the civilized world itself, leaving a legacy that far surpassed their humble slave origins.